The children were playing in the gardens when the sky began to burn. Maria Santos had just finished teaching her morning class about Earth's ancient history when the first explosions lit up New Terra's horizon. Through the classroom windows, she watched massive ships descend through the atmosphere like falling meteors, their hulls glowing red-hot from entry friction. The children pressed their faces against the glass, pointing excitedly at what they thought was some kind of celebration. Teacher. "Maria, are those fireworks?" asked little Tommy, his 7-year-old eyes wide with wonder. Maria felt ice form in her stomach as she recognized the distinctive wedge shapes of draconian hegemony warships. She had seen enough news reports from the border conflicts to know death when she saw it approaching. "Everyone away from the windows." "Now," she said, her voice calm despite the terror crawling up her throat. New Terra had been humanity's greatest achievement. 3 billion people called this world home, living in gleaming cities that stretched from the polar caps to the equatorial forests. The planet had vast oceans, breathable air, and soil rich enough to feed half the galaxy. Children born here had never known war, never known hunger, never known fear. That innocence died in the first 30 seconds. The plasma bombardment began without warning. Beams of superheated energy lanced down from the invasion fleet, turning entire city blocks into glass craters. The orbital defense platforms that were supposed to protect the planet exploded like firecrackers, their debris raining down in burning streaks. Maria herded her students into the school's basement shelter, designed for meteor storms and natural disasters. It had never been intended to protect against a full military assault. Through the thick walls, they could hear the rumble of explosions getting closer, the screams of emergency sirens, and the terrible sound of a world dying. "Why are they doing this?" whispered Sarah, an older girl who understood enough to be truly frightened. Maria pulled the child close, not knowing how to explain genocide to someone who had never seen violence beyond playground arguments. How do you tell a child that sometimes species killed each other for reasons too cruel and senseless to understand? Above them, the capital city of New Geneva was being systematically destroyed. The hegemony forces moved through the streets like hunters, their massive reptilian forms cutting down anyone who ran. They weren't interested in conquest or occupation. They had come to make a statement written in blood and fire. War Prince Krell stood on the command deck of his flagship, watching the destruction with satisfaction. The humans had grown too comfortable, too confident in their place among the stars. Their colonies spread across dozens of systems. Their traders appeared in every major port. Their diplomats spoke with voices that carried weight in the Galactic Council. It was time to remind them of their proper place. "Status report," he commanded. His tactical officer consulted a holographic display. "Orbital defenses eliminated. Major population centers under bombardment. Estimated civilian casualties approaching 2 million and climbing." Krell nodded approvingly. The humans valued their civilians above all else, a weakness that could be exploited. Every dead human child was another crack in their species' resolve, another step toward their eventual submission. "Continue the assault. Leave no structure standing. When we are finished here, New Terra will serve as an example to any human who thinks their kind can challenge the natural order." In the school basement, Maria felt the building shake as something massive struck nearby. The lights flickered and went out, leaving them in darkness broken only by the emergency chemical lamps. One of the younger children began to cry, a sound that seemed to trigger a chain reaction among the others. "Shh," Maria whispered, gathering them close. "We're going to play a game. The quietest person wins a prize." It was a lie, of course. There would be no prizes, no games, no tomorrow for most of them. But hope was sometimes all you could offer in the face of absolute horror. The bombardment continued for 6 hours. When it finally stopped, the silence was almost worse than the explosions. Maria waited another hour before venturing outside with the children, emerging into a world transformed into a nightmare landscape. New Geneva was gone. Where the city had stood that morning, only fused glass and twisted metal remained. The sky was black with smoke, and the air tasted of burned plastic and worse things. In the distance, fires still raged where fuel depots and chemical plants had been hit. Of the 3 billion people who had called New Terra home, fewer than 100 million had survived. Most of those were in rural areas or underground facilities that had escaped the initial assault. The great cities, the spaceports, the universities, the hospitals, all reduced to radioactive ash. Maria held Tommy's hand as they walked through the ruins of their neighborhood. The boy had stopped asking questions. He had seen too much, learned too quickly that the universe was not the safe, friendly place the adults had promised him it would be. "Where do we go now?" asked Sarah. Maria looked up at the smoke-stained sky, where the shapes of hegemony ships still moved like circling vultures. In the distance, she could hear the sound of engines as evacuation ships tried to rescue survivors, under the watchful eyes of their tormentors. "Home," she said finally. "We go home to Earth." But even as she spoke the words, Maria knew that home would never be the same. The galaxy had shown humanity its true face, revealed the price of trust, and the cost of weakness. New Terra had been more than a colony. It had been proof that humans could build something beautiful among the stars. Now it was a graveyard, a monument to naivety, and a lesson written in the ashes of the innocent. The children didn't understand, yet what they had witnessed, what it meant for their species and their future, they would learn soon enough. The galaxy had declared war on humanity's dreams, had shown that kindness was weakness and cooperation was foolishness. But the galaxy had made one crucial mistake. They had assumed that humans, like other civilized species, would accept their losses and submit to the new reality. They had forgotten that humans came from a world that had spent millions of years trying to kill them, where survival meant fighting back against impossible odds. They had forgotten that sometimes, when you destroy someone's home, you don't break their spirit. You forge it into something harder and more dangerous than you ever imagined possible. The evacuation ship that rescued Maria and her students was one of thousands carrying survivors back to human space. Each ship carried more than refugees. They carried witnesses, carriers of a story that would spread through every human world like wildfire. The galaxy thought it had taught humanity a lesson about power and their place in the cosmic order. Instead, they had just awakened something they should have left sleeping. The funeral pyres burned for 3 days above Earth's atmosphere. Alex Rivera had never seen so many ships in one place. The entire home fleet had assembled in Earth's orbital space, their hulls painted black in mourning for the dead of New Terra. But these weren't just warships. Every civilian vessel that could carry weapons had been pressed into service, from cargo haulers to luxury yachts. The fury that burned in humanity's heart had transformed ordinary people into soldiers. Alex stood in the observation deck of the converted passenger liner Hope's Dawn, watching as another ship joined the growing armada. The liner had been stripped of everything unnecessary and fitted with missile pods where the swimming pools used to be. Its captain was a former cruise ship officer who had volunteered the moment news of New Terra reached Earth. "How many is that now?" asked Dr. Helen Murphy, a xenobiologist who had signed up as a combat medic despite having no military training. 800 and counting, Alex replied, checking his tablet. "More arriving every hour." Helen shook her head in amazement. "I've studied dozens of species, Alex. When most civilizations suffer losses like this, they negotiate, they compromise, they accept some form of tribute or reparation. They don't—" She gestured at the massive fleet gathering outside. "They don't what?" "They don't mobilize their entire civilization for war." Alex understood her confusion. Most galactic species had evolved on worlds with abundant resources and few natural predators. They had developed sophisticated diplomatic traditions, because cooperation had always been more profitable than conflict. Even their wars were carefully managed affairs, with complex rules about acceptable targets and proper conduct. Humanity was different. They came from a world that had tried to kill them at every step of their evolution. Ice ages, asteroid impacts, supervolcanic eruptions, plague, predators. Earth had thrown everything at the human species, and somehow they had survived. More than survived, they had thrived, had turned a death world into a garden through sheer stubborn determination. The galaxy had just reminded them of those old lessons. In the depths of Luna's military command center, General Patricia Wu studied tactical displays that showed the full scope of humanity's mobilization. Every world, every station, every colony was contributing ships and personnel to the growing fleet. The response had been so overwhelming that her biggest problem was coordinating the logistics of the largest military operation in human history. Status. "Report from the outer colonies," announced Colonel Davis, her chief of staff. "They're stripping the mining platforms of everything that can be weaponized. The asteroid belt operations have volunteered to serve as forward supply bases. Even the research stations are asking how they can contribute." General Wu nodded grimly. She had expected a strong response to the New Terra massacre, but this was unprecedented. Humanity wasn't just mobilizing its military, the entire species was preparing for war. What about the diplomatic situation? Ambassador Kim withdrew from the Galactic Council yesterday. Official word is that we're handling the matter through our own channels. Unofficially? Davis paused. Unofficially, we've told them that anyone who interferes will be considered an enemy combatant. The general considered this. Humanity had spent 50 years building relationships with other species, establishing trade agreements and mutual defense pacts. All of that was being thrown away in favor of a path that could only lead to isolation and conflict. But then she thought about the children of New Terra, about the 3 billion voices that would never speak again, and she knew there was no other choice. Meanwhile, in the outer system, Dr. James Cole worked frantically in his laboratory aboard Research Station Omega. Before the massacre, he had been studying theoretical weapons applications of human technology, work that was considered academically interesting, but militarily impractical. Now his research had become humanity's most urgent priority. "The AI targeting systems are ready for field testing," he reported to his team via hologram. "We've managed to network them across multiple platforms so they can coordinate attacks in real time." His assistant, Dr. Lisa Park, looked up from her workstation. "James, are you sure about this? These systems are designed to operate independently of human oversight. Once we deploy them, we won't be able to control what they do." Cole paused in his work. The artificial intelligences he had created were capable of processing battlefield information faster than any human could comprehend. They could coordinate the movement of thousands of ships, calculate optimal firing solutions, and adapt to changing tactical situations in milliseconds. They were also completely ruthless in their pursuit of victory. "The hegemony killed 3 billion civilians," he said quietly. "They targeted schools, hospitals, refugee camps. They made it clear that they don't recognize any limits on warfare." He looked around the laboratory at the other researchers who had volunteered to work on the project. Maybe it's time they learned what war looks like when humans stop holding back. The transformation wasn't limited to military technology. Across human space, social and cultural changes were happening with breathtaking speed. Art became propaganda. Music became battle hymns. Poetry became epitaphs for the dead. On Mars, factory worker Diego Santos had never considered himself a soldier. He had spent his life building terraforming equipment and habitat domes, honest work that helped humanity, spread across the stars. But when the call came for volunteers, he was among the first to sign up. "My daughter was on New Terra," he told the recruitment officer. "She was studying to be a teacher, wanted to help human children learn about the galaxy. The officer nodded, sympathetically. Similar stories were being repeated millions of times across human space. Everyone had lost someone on New Terra, whether family, friends, or simply fellow humans they had never met, but felt connected to through bonds of species and shared experience. "What can you do?" the officer asked. Diego smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I can build things, and I can take things apart. The hegemony is about to learn that the same hands that built their cities can tear them down just as easily." The psychological impact of the mobilization was felt throughout the galaxy. Other species watched in fascination and growing alarm. As humanity transformed itself from a peaceful trading partner into something resembling a military hive mind, every human seemed to be working toward the same goal with the same grim determination. Even former allies began to distance themselves from human space. Ambassador Kim received the message from the Centaurian Republic while reviewing casualty reports from New Terra. The Centaurians had been among humanity's closest friends, partners in numerous scientific and cultural exchanges. "The Republic regrets to inform you that we can no longer maintain our mutual defense agreement," the message stated. "While we sympathize with humanity's loss, we cannot support what appears to be a campaign of vengeance that threatens galactic stability." Kim deleted the message without responding. There would be time to rebuild those relationships later, after the galaxy learned that some lines should never be crossed. In the depths of space, the human fleet continued to grow. Ships arrived from every corner of human territory, their crews, united by grief and purpose. Veterans of the border wars served alongside civilian volunteers. Scientists worked beside factory workers. Teachers became tacticians, and children became symbols of everything humanity was fighting to protect. The galaxy had always seen humans as emotional, impulsive beings whose reactions were driven by feeling rather than logic. They had assumed that made humanity weak, that emotional decisions were inherently inferior to calculated ones. They were about to learn the difference between emotion and passion, between impulse and determination, between weakness and the kind of strength that comes from having nothing left to lose. The draconian hegemony had intended to make an example of New Terra to show other species what happened when they challenged the established order. They had succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. They had created an example that would burn across the galaxy like a wildfire, a demonstration of what happened when you mistook human civilization for human nature, when you confused their desire for peace with inability to wage war. The stars themselves were about to witness something unprecedented. An entire species united in purpose, armed with technology beyond anything the galaxy had seen, and driven by a fury that would not be satisfied until justice was done. War Prince Krell had awakened something that had been sleeping in the human genome for 50,000 years, something that remembered what it took to survive on a world where everything was trying to kill you. Now it was his turn to learn. The first battle happened at a place called Razor's Edge, where two asteroid fields created a natural maze of rock and metal. The hegemony had chosen the location carefully, believing their superior numbers and heavier ships would dominate in the confined space. Lieutenant Commander Rosa Martinez piloted her fighter through the deadly obstacle course, her hands steady on the controls despite the chaos erupting around her. Behind her, a wing of converted civilian craft followed her lead, their pilots former cargo haulers and taxi drivers who had learned to fight in the months since New Terra burned. "Contact bearing 270, announced her wingman, a former pizza delivery pilot named Pete, who had signed up the day after the massacre. "Hegemony interceptor closing fast." Rosa smiled grimly and rolled her fighter inverted, diving beneath a tumbling asteroid the size of a city block. The hegemony pilot, trained in the formal aerial combat traditions of his species, followed in a predictable pursuit curve. He never saw the missile coming from Pete's ship until it was too late. "Splash 1, Pete reported with satisfaction. "These Lizards fight like they're dancing at a wedding. Rosa understood what he meant. The hegemony pilots were skilled, but they fought according to ancient codes of honor that emphasized individual prowess and single combat. They had never learned to fight as a pack, never developed the brutal efficiency that came from treating war as a problem to be solved rather than a contest to be won. Humans had learned different lessons. In the command center of the converted, luxury liner Golden Dream, Captain Emma Thompson watched the battle unfold on her tactical displays. The Golden Dream had once carried wealthy tourists on pleasure cruises through scenic nebulae. Now it served as a mobile command platform, its ballrooms converted to strategy centers, and its spas turned into medical bays. Enemy formation is breaking. Up, reported her tactical officer, a former casino dealer who had never seen combat before joining the fleet. Our fighters are using hit-and-run tactics. The hegemony ships are having trouble coordinating their response. Thompson nodded approvingly. The human fleet had abandoned traditional battle line tactics in favor of something more chaotic and unpredictable. Their ships moved like schools of fish, scattering when threatened and converging when opportunities presented themselves. "Signal the Wolf Pack to begin their attack run," she ordered. The Wolf Pack was Captain Rodriguez's innovation, a group of converted cargo haulers that had been stripped down to bare essentials and loaded with every missile they could carry. They weren't built for survival. They were built to deliver maximum firepower in the shortest possible time. Captain Maria Rodriguez had been hauling medical supplies between the outer colonies when New Terra was destroyed. Her entire family had been visiting the planet on vacation. Her parents, her sister, her 2 nephews. None of them had survived the first wave of bombardment. Now she commanded 12 converted freighters on a mission that was part military operation, part suicide run. "All ships, this is Rodriguez. Target the enemy flagship. Full missile spread on my mark." Her ships emerged from behind a cluster of asteroids like ghosts materializing from the void. The hegemony fleet, focused on the fighter engagement happening elsewhere in the system, was caught completely off guard by the sudden appearance of what appeared to be civilian vessels. Mark. 1,200 missiles launched simultaneously, their combined exhaust turning space into a constellation of deadly stars. The hegemony flagship, a massive dreadnought that had never been seriously threatened in over 2 centuries of service, suddenly found itself facing more incoming ordnance than its defensive systems could handle. War Prince Krell felt his ship shudder under the first impacts and realized with growing horror that he was about to die. Not in single combat with a worthy opponent, not in a glorious last stand against impossible odds, but in a calculated assassination carried out by beings who treated war like an industrial process. "Damage report," he roared. "Hull breaches on. 17 decks. Engine room is gone. Life support is failing in the forward sections." His aide's voice cracked with disbelief. "Sir, how did civilian ships carry so much firepower?" Krell didn't have an answer. In hegemony military doctrine, there were clear distinctions between military vessels and civilian craft. The idea of converting passenger ships into weapons platforms violated every principle of civilized warfare. But humans, he was learning, had very different ideas about civilization. The flagship's death took 4 minutes. When it finally exploded, the blast was visible throughout the asteroid field, a brief new star that marked the end of hegemony invincibility. Rodriguez watched the explosion with grim satisfaction. "All Wolfpack vessels, mission accomplished. Return to base for refit and rearm." Of her 12 ships, only 7 remained combat-capable. The others had been destroyed or crippled by the flagship's death throes. But the trade was worth it. The destruction of a hegemony dreadnought would send shockwaves throughout their military hierarchy. Meanwhile, in another part of the system, Sergeant Davis led his squad through the corridors of a captured hegemony supply station. The boarding action had been swift and brutal, overwhelming the defenders before they could mount an effective resistance. Davis had been a police officer on New Terra, one of the few who had survived the bombardment by being on duty in an underground bunker when the attack began. He had seen the aftermath of the massacre, had walked through streets filled with the bodies of people he had sworn to protect. Now he was learning that the same skills that made him good at police work, patience, attention to detail, understanding, human behavior, also made him effective at war. "Movement in the next compartment," whispered Private Collins, a former school teacher who had volunteered for ground combat duty. Davis nodded and signaled for his squad to take positions. The hegemony soldiers they were facing were larger and stronger than humans, genetically engineered for combat. But they had learned to fight in formal duels and structured battles. They weren't prepared for humans who treated every engagement like a problem to be solved with the most efficient means available. The firefight lasted less than 30 seconds. When it was over, 6 hegemony soldiers were dead, and Davis's squad had suffered only minor injuries. "Secure the computer core," Davis ordered. "Download everything. These lizards are about to learn that humans are very good at learning from their mistakes." The Battle of Razor's Edge lasted 18 hours and ended with the complete destruction of the hegemony fleet. Of the 230 ships that had entered the system, fewer than 50 escaped. The rest were destroyed or captured, their crews either dead or prisoners. The human losses were also significant. Over 100 ships destroyed and thousands of personnel killed or wounded. But the strategic impact was overwhelming. For the first time in their history, the hegemony had suffered a major military defeat. More importantly, they had learned that humanity's approach to warfare was fundamentally different from anything they had encountered before. General Wu studied the after-action reports from her command center on Luna. The battle had been a tactical victory, but she could see the larger implications of what had happened. "They're going to adapt," she told her staff. "The hegemony isn't stupid. They'll learn from this defeat and adjust their tactics." Colonel Davis nodded agreement. "Intelligence suggests they're already recalling fleets from border sectors to reinforce their core systems. They're treating this as a major threat." Wu smiled coldly. "Good. Let them pull their forces back. Every ship they recall is another system that becomes vulnerable to our advance." She gestured at the strategic display, showing human space and surrounding territories. "The hegemony made a fundamental error in their planning. They assumed we would fight like other species, that we would follow established protocols and respect traditional limitations." Her expression hardened as she thought about the children who had died on New Terra, the families torn apart by hegemony. Arrogance. They're about to learn that humans don't fight wars. We solve problems. And right now, the draconian hegemony is a problem that needs solving. In the depths of space, the human fleet regrouped and prepared for the next phase of their campaign. The Battle of Razor's Edge had been the opening move in a larger strategy, a demonstration of capability that would force the enemy to react. But it was also a promise, a declaration that humanity would not stop until every world that had cheered. The destruction of New Terra understood the consequences of their choices. The galaxy had wanted to see human emotion in action. Now they would learn the difference between emotion and focused fury, between reactive violence and calculated vengeance. The hunters had become the hunted, and the human race was just getting started. The children of Hegemony Prime had never seen rain that burned. Dr. Amy Chen watched from the medical station's observation deck as the droplets fell from the poisoned sky, each one glowing faintly with radioactive particles. The planet's atmosphere had been seeded with compounds that would make it uninhabitable for decades, a gift from humanity's new chemical warfare division. "The evacuation is proceeding faster than expected," reported Lieutenant Torres, her liaison with the occupying forces. "The civilian population is cooperating fully." Amy nodded absently, her attention focused on the readings from her atmospheric sensors. The compounds falling from the sky were designed to be temporary. They would break down naturally within 5 years, leaving the planet habitable again. But the psychological impact would last much longer. Any word from the resistance cells? Scattered and ineffective. Most of their leadership was eliminated in the first week of occupation. Torres paused, consulting his tablet. The few remaining groups are more focused on evacuation assistance than military action. Amy understood why. The human occupation of Hegemony Prime had been unlike anything in galactic military history. Instead of trying to hold territory through brute force, they had systematically dismantled the planet's ability to function as a military center while providing safe passage for any civilians who wanted to leave. The strategy was working. After 6 months of occupation, nearly 8 billion Hegemony citizens had voluntarily relocated to other worlds, leaving behind only the most essential personnel and die-hard military holdouts. In the former capital city, Commander Michael Park supervised the demolition of the Hegemony's primary military academy. The massive complex had trained officer candidates for over 1,000 years, its halls decorated with banners celebrating victories over dozens of conquered species. Now it was being systematically reduced to rubble by human engineers who treated the destruction like any other construction project. "Final sweep complete," reported Sergeant Williams, emerging from the academy's lower levels. "No remaining personnel or sensitive materials. The building is clear for demolition." Park nodded and activated his communicator. "This is Park to Demo Team. You are cleared to bring down the main structure." The explosion was carefully controlled, designed to collapse the building inward rather than damage surrounding areas. In seconds, a monument to Hegemony military pride became a pile of debris that would be recycled into housing for refugees. "That's the last of the major installations," Williams observed. "What's next on the list?" Park consulted his orders. "Industrial complexes in the southern continent, shipyards, weapons factories, anything that could support military production." He looked up at the poisoned sky. "By the time we're finished here, it'll take the Hegemony 50 years to rebuild their war machine." The occupation of Hegemony Prime was only one part of humanity's larger campaign. Across dozens of systems, human forces were systematically dismantling the infrastructure that supported Hegemony military power. But they weren't doing it through traditional conquest. They were doing it through economic and social pressure that made resistance pointless. Captain Lisa Rodriguez commanded the blockade fleet surrounding the industrial world of Forge Prime. Her ships, mostly converted civilian vessels, maintained a loose cordon around the planet while broadcasting a continuous message to the surface. "Attention, citizens of Forge Prime. The planet is under economic quarantine by the United Earth Federation. Any person wishing to relocate to safer territory will be provided free transportation and resettlement assistance. Any military personnel willing to surrender will be treated according to galactic standards for prisoners of war." The message had been playing for 3 months. In that time, over 2 million people had accepted the offer of relocation, including most of the planet's industrial workforce. The remaining population was struggling to maintain basic services, let alone military production. "Sir," reported her communications officer, "we're receiving another surrender request from the surface. This one is from the Planetary Defense Coordinator." Rodriguez smiled. "Put him through." The face that appeared on her main screen belonged to a tired-looking Hegemony officer whose uniform showed signs of poor maintenance. Behind him, Rodriguez could see the Spartan interior of what looked like an emergency command center. "This is Defense Coordinator Vex. I formally surrender the remaining military assets on Forge Prime to human forces. My personnel are prepared to accept prisoner status in exchange for guaranteed safety and medical care." "Accepted," Rodriguez replied. "Prepare landing coordinates for our transport ships. You and your people will be treated fairly." After the transmission ended, her tactical officer shook his head in amazement. "That's the 15th planet to surrender without a fight. I've never seen anything like this." Rodriguez understood his confusion. Traditional military doctrine suggested that conquering an interstellar empire should require massive battles and enormous casualties. Instead, humanity was achieving its objectives through a combination of economic pressure, psychological, warfare, and simple, practical demonstration of superior capability. Why fight when you know you can't win? She mused. These people aren't stupid. They can see what happened to every hegemony force that tried to stand against us. The pattern had been established at Razor's Edge and repeated dozens of times since then. Whenever hegemony forces engaged human fleets in direct combat, they were systematically outfought and destroyed. The human military machine had evolved beyond anything the galaxy had seen before, combining advanced technology with tactics that treated warfare as an engineering problem rather than a contest of honor. But the real genius of humanity's campaign wasn't military, it was social. Ambassador David Kim sat in his temporary office aboard the command ship Relentless, reviewing reports from human diplomatic teams scattered across neutral space. The same species that had refused to help humanity seek justice were now quietly reaching out to establish contact with what had clearly become the galaxy's new dominant power. The Crystalline Assembly wants to open formal negotiations, reported his aide. They're offering to mediate a peace settlement between humanity and the hegemony. Kim laughed bitterly. How generous of them. Where was this helpful spirit when New Terra was burning? His aide shifted uncomfortably. They claim they want to prevent further bloodshed. I'm sure they do. What they really want is to make sure they're on the winning side when this is over. Kim pulled up a holographic display showing the current strategic situation. What's the status of Operation Clean Slate? Phase 3 is ahead of schedule. The hegemony has lost effective control of 60% of their territory. Most of their remaining military assets are concentrated around the core systems, but morale is reportedly at critical levels. Kim studied the display thoughtfully. Operation Clean Slate had been humanity's answer to the galaxy's indifference. Instead of seeking allies or building coalitions, they had simply demonstrated that they didn't need anyone's help to achieve their objectives. The psychological impact had been devastating. Every species that had remained neutral during humanity's hour of need was now watching their assumptions about galactic power dynamics crumble in real time. In the depths of space near hegemony, Prime's outer sensor perimeter, Dr. James Cole supervised the deployment of humanity's latest strategic weapon. The devices looked harmless enough, small satellites no larger than communication relays, but their function was far more sinister. Final positioning complete, reported his technical team. The network is online and ready for activation. Cole nodded and activated his communicator. This is Cole to Fleet Command. The silence array is operational. The silence array was humanity's most psychological weapon. Once activated, it would jam all communications within the target system, effectively isolating any world from outside contact. The technology wasn't particularly advanced, but its implications were terrifying. A civilization that couldn't communicate couldn't coordinate. Planets that couldn't call for help were vulnerable to gradual collapse through social and economic pressure. Most importantly, populations that couldn't receive news from the outside world were left to imagine the worst about what was happening in the larger war. Excellent work, Doctor, came the reply from Fleet Command. How long until the array reaches full effectiveness? Cole consulted his readings. Approximately 6 hours for complete communications blackout. After that, Hegemony Prime will be effectively cut off from their remaining territories. It was a fitting conclusion to humanity's campaign against the hegemony homeworld. The planet that had once been the center of a galactic empire would soon be nothing more than an isolated world, its people dependent on human goodwill for their basic survival. Dr. Amy Chen watched the burning rain continue to fall as the last transport ships lifted off from Hegemony Prime's primary spaceport. The great evacuation was nearly complete, leaving behind only those who had chosen to accept human occupation rather than abandon their homeworld. Final passenger count is just over 10 billion relocated, reported Lieutenant Torres. That's roughly 80% of the planet's original population. Amy made notes on her tablet. Medical screening for the evacuees? Completed. No signs of disease or biological weapons. The hegemony may be many things, but they're not interested in bioterror. That was something, at least. The human occupation forces had been careful to treat civilian populations with respect and dignity, even while systematically dismantling their government and military infrastructure. It was a deliberate choice. Humanity wanted to be seen as liberators rather than conquerors, even by their enemies. The strategy was working. Reports from across former hegemony space indicated that most civilian populations were accepting human authority without resistance. Some were even welcoming it, particularly on worlds where hegemony rule had been harsh and oppressive. "Any word from Earth Command about the next phase?" Torres asked. Amy smiled grimly. Phase 5 begins next. Week. The hegemony's remaining core worlds will be given a simple choice: surrender and accept occupation, or face the same fate as Hegemony Prime. She looked out at the poisoned sky, at the rain that would continue falling until the planet's atmosphere had been thoroughly cleansed of its industrial capacity. "I suspect most of them will choose surrender. The Galactic Council chamber had never been so quiet." Ambassador David Kim walked slowly across the polished floor toward the speaking platform, his footsteps echoing in the vast space like gunshots. Around him, representatives from 47 species sat in stunned silence, their various forms of communication equipment dark and useless. The humans had made their point clear. This session would proceed under Earth's rules, not the Council's traditional protocols. Behind Kim, Admiral Rebecca Torres and General Patricia Wu flanked the entrance in full military dress uniform. They weren't there to negotiate or seek permission. They were there to deliver terms. "Honored delegates," Kim began, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustics. "1 year ago, I stood in this same spot and asked for justice. I requested that this council condemn the genocide committed against New Terra and take action against those responsible." He paused, looking around at faces that avoided his gaze. "You chose neutrality. You chose to protect a system that allowed 3 billion innocent humans to be murdered without consequence. Today, I return to inform you that humanity has solved the problem you were unwilling to address." Counselor Veth, her crystalline form flickering with nervous energy, finally spoke up. "Ambassador Kim, the Council recognizes that justice needed to be served, but the scale of humanity's response has destabilized the entire galactic order. Surely we can reach some form of accommodation that restores peace while acknowledging your legitimate grievances." Kim smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "Peace, Counselor? You mean the kind of peace that existed when the hegemony was free to commit genocide whenever it suited their strategic interests? The kind of peace that required species like mine to accept whatever fate stronger civilizations chose to inflict upon us?" He gestured toward the tactical display that materialized in the center of the chamber, showing the current state of galactic politics. The draconian hegemony's territory was marked in gray: conquered, occupied, or abandoned. Nearly 2/3 of their former empire now flew human flags. "The hegemony no longer exists as a military power," Kim announced. "Their fleets have been destroyed or captured. Their industrial base has been dismantled. Their government has formally surrendered and accepted human administration of their former territories." Murmurs of shock rippled through the assembly. The speed and completeness of humanity's victory had exceeded even the most pessimistic projections. "But this wasn't just about the hegemony," Kim continued. "This was about demonstrating that the old order, where stronger species could prey upon weaker ones with impunity, is finished. Humanity has proven that any civilization willing to commit genocide will face consequences so severe that the crime becomes impossible to contemplate." Dr. Lisa Park sat in the observation gallery, watching the proceedings with fascination. As one of humanity's leading xenopsychologists, she had been studying the psychological impact of the war on other species. The results were remarkable. "Look at their body language," she whispered to her colleague, Dr. James Wright. Fear, respect, calculation? They're all trying to figure out where they stand in the new hierarchy. Wright nodded thoughtfully. The Centaurians are probably regretting their decision to abandon their mutual defense pact with us. The Zephyrian Trade Alliance looks like they're ready to offer us exclusive commercial agreements. And the smaller species? Relief, mostly. For the first time in galactic history, they're seeing that size and military power don't guarantee impunity. The humans have just demonstrated that genocide has consequences. Park understood what he meant. The Galactic Order had always been based on a careful balance of power between the largest military forces. Smaller species survived by staying out of conflicts between the major powers and accepting whatever terms were imposed upon them. Humanity had just shattered that system by proving that even the strongest could be brought low if they went too far. In his quarters aboard the captured Hegemony flagship Dominion of Scales, former War Prince Krell stared out at the stars through reinforced transparasteel. The ship that had once been the symbol of his people's military might now serve as a prison transport, carrying him and other high-ranking war criminals to Earth for trial. The humans have offered me a choice, he told his former aide, who shared the cell with him. Cooperation with their war crimes tribunal in exchange for a life sentence on a penal colony or execution for genocide. His aide, a younger officer named Vex, looked up from the datapad he had been reading. What will you choose, my lord? Krell considered the question. The humans had been scrupulously correct in their treatment of prisoners, following their own legal standards rather than the harsh military codes the hegemony used. It was another demonstration of their fundamental difference in approach. They fought total war when necessary, but they retained their concepts of justice and proportionality even toward their enemies. I will cooperate, he said finally. Not because I fear death, but because I want to understand them. How did a species we dismissed as weak emotional creatures become the most dangerous military force in the galaxy? Vex nodded thoughtfully. The interrogation reports suggest they never considered themselves weak. They believed they were showing restraint, not revealing weakness. When we killed their civilians, we didn't break their spirit. We gave them permission to stop holding back. It was a sobering thought. The hegemony had based their attack on New Terra on the assumption that humans were fundamentally soft, that their emotional responses would make them easy to manipulate and control. Instead, they had discovered that human emotions could fuel a level of focused determination that surpassed anything in their experience. Meanwhile, on Earth, President Maria Santos addressed a joint session of the Global Parliament from her office in Geneva. Behind her, the flags of dozens of former hegemony worlds flew alongside Earth's banner, symbols of humanity's new role as the galaxy's dominant power. My fellow humans, she began, 1 year ago, we were citizens of the galaxy's newest member species, seeking our place among the stars through cooperation and peaceful development. Today, we stand as the inheritors of responsibilities we never sought but cannot abandon. She gestured toward a holographic display showing the vast territories now under human administration. 67 worlds containing over 40 billion sentient beings now look to humanity for leadership and protection. This is not a burden we take lightly, nor is it a power we intend to abuse. The president's expression grew serious as she continued. We have learned that in this galaxy, peace is not the natural state of affairs. It is something that must be actively maintained through strength and vigilance. The cost of weakness is measured in the deaths of innocents. She paused, thinking of the children who had died on New Terra, whose voices would never again be heard, but whose memory had transformed human civilization. Therefore, I am announcing the formation of the Terran Federation, a new political entity that will encompass all worlds under human protection. This federation will be governed by principles of justice, equality, and mutual defense. No member world will ever again face genocide alone. The announcement sent shockwaves throughout galactic civilization. Humanity wasn't just expanding their territory, They were creating an entirely new form of interstellar government based on their own values and experiences. In the depths of space, construction crews worked around the clock to complete humanity's most ambitious project yet. The Sentinel stations were massive orbital platforms positioned at strategic points throughout former hegemony space, each one capable of monitoring entire star systems and responding to threats with overwhelming force. Engineer Captain Robert Kim supervised the installation of the final sensor array on Sentinel Station Alpha, positioned at the edge of what had once been hegemony core space. The station was larger than most cities, its bulk bristling with defensive weapons and early warning systems. "Final systems check complete," reported his technical team. "All sensor networks are online and operational." Kim nodded with satisfaction. The Sentinel network represented humanity's answer to the galaxy's chaotic political situation. Instead of relying on treaties and diplomatic agreements that could be broken when convenient, they had created a technological solution that would make aggression against any member of the Terran Federation prohibitively costly. "Signal Earth Command," he ordered. "Sentinel Alpha is operational and ready to assume Guardian duties." The response came back within minutes. "Understood, Captain. Welcome to the Watch." The Watch. It was an appropriate term for what humanity had taken upon itself. Someone had to guard the galaxy against the kind of atrocity that had befallen New Terra. Someone had to ensure that genocide would never again be an acceptable tool of interstellar politics. The galaxy had proven that existing institutions were inadequate to the task. So humanity had created new institutions, backed by the kind of military power that made enforcement possible rather than theoretical. Back in the council chamber, Ambassador Kim concluded his presentation with words that would be remembered throughout galactic history. "Humanity offers the galaxy a simple proposition," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the vast chamber. "We will use our power to protect the innocent and punish those who commit atrocities against civilian populations. We will not interfere in legitimate territorial disputes or honest political disagreements. But we will respond to genocide, mass murder, and crimes against sentient life with the full force of human military capability." He looked around the chamber one final time, making eye contact with representatives who had once dismissed humanity as naive newcomers to galactic civilization. "The choice is yours. You can work with us to build a galaxy where strength serves justice, or you can discover what happens when you mistake human mercy for human weakness." As Kim and his escorts left the chamber, the assembled delegates sat in stunned silence, processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. The old galactic order was dead, killed in the fires of New Terra and buried beneath the wreckage of the hegemony fleet. In its place, humanity had constructed something unprecedented, a civilization built on the principle that some crimes were so heinous they demanded immediate and overwhelming response, regardless of the political consequences. The stars had witnessed humanity's wrath, and they would never forget the lesson. In a galaxy where might had always made right, the humans had proven that sometimes the mightiest civilization was the one willing to risk everything to protect others. The age of human dominance had begun, built not on conquest or exploitation, but on the simple recognition that if no one else would defend the innocent, then humanity would take on that burden alone, and they would carry it for as long as necessary. Because that was what humans did when faced with injustice. They found a way to make it right, whatever the cost.